Okay, we're now turning to the actual fossil record. We've talked about what fossils are, what they can do for us, how we can date them, but probably most importantly, we need to understand how fossils represent the evolutionary process. And in fact, by looking into the geological record and finding fossils from the past, we can test whether our microevolutionary processes mirror the ones on the macro scale. So when we look at the way evolution works on a small time span, does this actually follow the same sort of principles in much longer spans of time? Especially when changing environments, when forests expand and contract, when there's extinctions of animals, when there's lots of environmental and topographical pressures. So the good news is that you'll find that actually the fossil record, while providing us with good evidence, actually seems to really support what we've been looking at already. It seems to fit very well. So we're not going to start with the evolution of all life on Earth. We've talked about single cell organisms and how we are really a collection of single cells that are guided by a single DNA. But we're not going to go all the way back into the earliest forms of life on Earth. We're not even going to go back to the dinosaurs. We're going to start looking at about the past 50 million years or so. And in fact, when the dinosaurs at the end of the Mesozoic era started to die out or and go extinct or have to adapt, primates had actually, mammals had already been existing around dinosaurs. But they were a minor form that was not quite as competitive to the great advantages that dinosaurs seem to have had at that time period. But then all sorts of environmental changes took place. There was catastrophes, and the natural selection pressures started to change. And mammals that had pre-existed suddenly were a minor form, but there was a void that was left blank by the disappearance of so many species of dinosaurs that mammals started to fill that space. Amongst those mammals, we will see that primates started to emerge as one form of those, one order of on the taxonomic scale of creatures that had certain adaptations. That the first primates are the relatives to the ancestors to all primates. So all monkeys, all lorises, all lemurs, all humans, all of our human ancestors, all of the apes, all of these find their origin at some point in the past, about 50 million years ago or so, when primates started to emerge as one, or a primate started to emerge as one adaptive strategy amongst mammals. So what were these changes that made primates successful? So why become a primate? What were the natural selection pressures, and how were these creatures getting the sort of selective advantages? And so why become a primate? And what were they? What were these first primates? Where do we find them? And so we want to also then look at the evolutionary links between the developments of the past primate species into later ones. So we want to look at that evolutionary process. On the slideshow, you see a creature that we're going to see a couple of times called Aegyptopithecus. And it's not the earliest primate. But it does represent this last point, that we want to look at the evolutionary developments that link species. Now, last chapter I talked about looking at dating things, and I talked about cultural dating, and I showed you talked about a slide of Mercedes-Benzes. And if you have a Mercedes-Benz from 1955 and a Mercedes-Benz from 2005, you would expect to see some sort of a transition in between there. So the 1985 is going to be in there someplace. And that may be a huge leap from 55 to 85 to 2005. But as you find more fossils, you'll actually see more of those transitions. So you'll find 65 and 75 and 95. So that's what finding these fossils tell us, is that there are these moments in time, these snapshots that we get with things like Aegyptopithecus, which is interesting because it's a creature that once lived, and it has a monkey-like body that has equal limbs, forelimbs and hind limbs. It has a tail. It has a C-shaped spine. That means that it would have walked over the tops of branches. And all of that body type looks like a monkey. But its head, its brain, its teeth, it has a sagittal crest, which is where the muscles attached for a stronger crushing motion with the jaw and the teeth. That's very ape-like. And so this Aegyptopithecus represents something that is transitional. And when you only have one fossil, you don't see the whole process taking place. But those snapshots are actually very important. So you can see a 1955 Mercedes-Benz and you can see a 2005 Mercedes-Benz, but it's hard to see that development unless you get something in the middle, a transition. That 1985 is important. Now, if we can fill in all of those gaps, the more we fill in, the better we see that transition taking place. So that's really what we're trying to do here in this chapter, is look at the examples that we have that tell this story of transformation and response to changing natural environments, into us, in fact. And the first primate fossil ever found was discovered in France by someone we've met before in an earlier chapter, Georges Cuvier. And he was one of the first people to recognize that extinctions take place. And he found he studied a fossil that was found, and he got it totally wrong. He didn't really understand what it was that he was looking at. He thought it was a small skull of an extinct hoofed creature, so he thought it was like a deer or something like that. But today, we now understand that this was adipus. Now, before we tear Cuvier to shreds, he had nothing else to refer to this to. He got it wrong, but we now understand that this actually fits into a picture of primate evolution. And so adipus is what we call this today. And it fits into tens of thousands of primate fossils that have been found from all over the world now. And in fact, some places that primates don't exist anymore, because the earth itself has changed since then. Now, it may be tempting to look at primates today as part of a progression, that like we see chimpanzees as kind of what we might once have been. That's misleading. And we need to understand that the living primates today are not on some ladder trying to become us. They are adapted to their environments, and their features represent their adaptations to their particular environment. And so this slide that you've got that has grip, you can see that there's a lot of different hand formations in living primates. Lorises, tarsiers, macaques, spider monkeys, gibbons, and humans. And each of them have different hand formations. We've got the same bones, but those bones are directed in development to have different forms, because those forms are well adapted for the environment in which those creatures are living. So it's tempting to think that the loris is primitive, but it's not. It's actually the much smaller forefinger is a specific adaptation to increase the grip. And they have a very strong grip. It's very specialized. It's not like ours. Ours has another specialization. Ours is not better than a loris's, our hand. We have a very long thumb, and that gives us a very good precision grip. Better than most, in fact. And so we can pick things up. And you saw how useful that was for primates in our video with David Attenborough, that showed that actually using your hands and being able to feel around things and manipulate things is a survival strategy. But also, as we're going to come to much later, this feature evolved later, millions of years later than we're talking about in this chapter, 50 million years ago. This sort of feature started to develop in only the past 10 million years or so ago. And as a consequence, the use of that precision grip has become more important, and things like tool use is enhanced by our ability to have precision grip. So the family tree that you see with different creatures on them doesn't represent our past. They represent different strategies. And so what we need to do that exists today, they're just as evolved as we are. So the other living primates are out there existing in the world, and they have developed and adapted those features to be successful in those environments. Now, the important thing for understanding our past is that creatures from the past that are our ancestors, that are now extinct, that are now gone, had similar environmental adaptations to things you might be able to observe today. So, life in the trees. What do primates that live in the trees have as features? Did our ancestors have these features? And we want to see how these things emerged. So, why did they emerge? And what were some of the features that are about that? Well, there's the arboreal hypothesis. And this is a very strong hypothesis. We've talked about this many times, that the adaptations for living in and moving around in the trees is one reason why the primates started to emerge. But there's a problem with this. It's not that the arboreal hypothesis is untrue, but it's not a good enough explanation on its own, because squirrels also live in trees, and squirrels are not primates. There are plenty of animals that live in and maneuver around trees that are not primates. And so what is it about primates, even if there are arboreal adaptations, living in trees may be one aspect of them, that's not enough for us to say this is why primates emerged as a separate order. So one thing that most other arboreal creatures don't have, that we do, and all primates do, is stereoscopic vision. And this was proposed by Cartmill as what's called the visual predation hypothesis. And this is the hypothesis that we can test that says that maybe primates emerged as hunters in forests, whereas things like squirrels have their eyes on the side of their head so they can keep away from predators. But maybe our forward-facing vision was for predation, that we were predators. But if that was the case, you would expect to see hunting as the primary food source strategy for primates today. You would expect there to be more hunting primates. And that's actually the exception more than it is the norm. The norm is that primates tend to be vegetarians or omnivores at most. You don't really get strictly predatory, meat-eating, carnivorous primates. That just isn't really a thing. So generalists can eat meat, and we do, humans and other primates do, but it doesn't seem to be satisfactory, this visual predation hypothesis, as a reason for why primates and not some other type of adaptations. And then there's another one called the angiosperm radiation hypothesis. Angiosperms are fruit-bearing trees, and so the one hypothesis is that a lot of primates eat fruit, and so as forests expanded, you had a particular type of adaptation to eating fruit, and these groups of primates that emerged as fruit eaters spread throughout all fruit-bearing forests around the world. Again, this is actually at this point very hard to test, but how do we test these? Well, we need to look at fossils. So if we go back to about the first part of the Cenozoic era, which is what we are currently in, which is recent life. So you've got, if you recall from before, you've got the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. So the old life, middle life, new life, and that we're in the new life period, which started about around 60 million years ago. And at this time, the continents were much closer together, and so you have groups of animals. One particular type of mammal called the Plesiadapiforms is interesting because they have sort of rodent-like features, rodent-like teeth. They've got eyes sort of like a raccoon. They've got big canines. Their hands and feet often have limited or no grasping ability, and they sometimes have claws. These are all things that we do not share. Well, so this is unrelated to us, right? Well, maybe not, because certain types of Plesiadapiforms started to evolve some features that are within our order. And it's possible that amongst Plesiadapiforms, which was a group of mammals, one branch of these called Carpolestes in particular may have started to develop some features that represent the first primates breaking off. If you look at the slide on Carpolestes, you'll see it looks quite squirrel-like, right? It looks like a squirrel in a tree. It's got a furry tail. It's got a face like a squirrel. It's got the eyes on the side of its head. But it looks like it was transitioning. It looks like it was starting to develop some characteristics that we later see developed into true primates. And this is not a true primate, but it's an interesting, possibly transitional form. So it still has claws on most of its digits, but it does have one nail. It has a toenail on its big toe. It also has grasping feet, which is something that many primates have. But it also has non-convergent eyes. So its eyes have not come back together. They're also not protected by any bones. So it probably also has a very well-defined sense of smell, which primates don't tend to have. That may be the transition between Plesiadapiforms, which are just generalized mammals in the early Cenozoic, into what we see, which are the euprimates, the first true primates. And these come in two forms, from about 56 million years ago to about 34 million years ago in the Eocene epoch. And there's actually 200 different species of actual true primates that we call euprimates, and these we know that they're primates because they have features that all primates have, with things like grasping hands, feet with nails instead of claws. They have larger brains, and that's something that all primates tend to have larger brains, and more generalized forms of teeth than the Plesiadapiforms had. They also have forward-facing eyes surrounded by a bit of a bone called the postorbital bar. It's not a full investment in protecting that bone with a complete eye orbit, but it is some extra protection for the eyes, which apparently are becoming increasingly important for survival. So visual sense is becoming more prominent. There's also high levels of sexual dimorphism, which is males tend to be larger than females, which is something that we find in later anthropoids, and we're anthropoids. There are two basic categories of Eocene euprimates. These are the hominoids and the adipids. We saw the adipid earlier with Georges Cuvier, who thought that that was a hoofed creature, but it was not. It's one of these first true primates, and the hominoids we think were nocturnal based on their certain features like their eyes. and nose. They also had a dental comb. We've seen this in other creatures, like the we saw in the video with the pygmy marmoset that had a dental comb and a fairly short snout. Whereas adipids are diurnal, meaning that they're active during the daytime. They have vertical incisors, and they're more sexually dimorphic, which is a trend that we find in later anthropoids. So these adipids in particular seem like they are more along the line of what would come to be things like ancestral to lemurs and strepsirrhines. But the hominoids have larger eyes, probably nocturnal, and a relatively short snout, which resembles modern tarsiers. So tarsiers are more closely related to anthropoids than lemurs, and so some suggest that hominoids are ancestral to anthropoids, including us. But that seems wrong, because adipids are diurnal and are more sexually dimorphic, like anthropoids too. So this is actually a huge debate in physical anthropology and human evolution as to whether the hominoids or the adipids are the ancestors to humans, because it can't really be both. They were starting to split from one another, these two branches of early primates, and we don't know. The answer is, I'm not going to give you the answer. But this is the facts as we have them now, and hopefully with more evidence we'll be able to answer this question. Who is our ancestor? The hominoids or the adipids? Anyway, you should learn them both. Amongst these groups, one primate called the Archicebus seems to be the earliest haplorhine. And these are from about 55 million years ago. We find Archicebus. They're small, they're diurnal, active during the daytime, they're arboreal, and they eat insects based on their teeth. And these may be the earliest of the haplorhines. And it had small eyes, but it had sharp cusped teeth, so it ate insects. And so its small eyes means it was active during the daytime. It had some monkey-like adaptations for climbing along the tops of branches. And interestingly, the evidence comes from China, which means that it's